If your childhood story still explains who you are not self-aware, you are unfinished. Sensitivity is often praised as a virtue, but rarely examined as a liability. When sensitivity is young, unformed, and unchallenged, it feels like depth. It feels like insight. It feels like moral elevation. But sensitivity without authority does not mature into wisdom. It decays into reactivity. The moment sensitivity replaces authority, it stops serving the psyche and starts ruling it. Authority does not mean dominance. It does not mean suppression or control. Authority is the capacity to stand above inner states without disowning them. It is the ability to feel deeply without being commanded by what is felt. Sensitivity, when left unchecked, inverts this relationship. Emotions become the decision makers. Moods become verdicts. Inner reactions are treated as truths instead of signals. This is how the trap forms. Sensitive people often learn early that feeling is safer than acting. Observation replaces risk. Understanding replaces confrontation. Emotional intelligence becomes a substitute for power. Over time, this creates an inner hierarchy where awareness sits at the top and authority is never developed. The person knows everything about what they feel, but nothing about what they can endure. Sensitivity begins to reward itself. It creates an identity around being perceptive, attuned, and emotionally refined. But identity freezes development. Once sensitivity becomes who you are, authority feels like betrayal, structure feels violent, discipline feels inauthentic, responsibility feels like a threat to the self-image. This is where sensitivity turns inward and becomes tyrannical. Every boundary feels harsh, every demand feels invasive, every consequence feels unfair. The inner world becomes exquisitely detailed but dangerously fragile. Life is experienced as something that happens to the psyche, not something shaped by it. The individual waits for alignment, permission, or safety before moving, and movement never comes. Authority, unlike sensitivity, is built through friction. It forms when inner chaos is held without discharge. It grows when emotions are contained long enough to be understood without being obeyed. Authority emerges when the psyche learns it can survive discomfort without collapsing into story. But sensitivity resists this process. It prefers explanation to endurance. It seeks meaning before mastery. It wants the world to soften before it hardens its own spine. This is why sensitive people often mistake emotional articulation for progress. Naming feelings feels like resolution. Understanding patterns feels like transformation. But nothing has changed until behavior changes. And behavior cannot change without authority. Authority says, I feel this, and I will act anyway. Sensitivity says, I feel this, therefore I cannot. Over time, this dynamic produces a subtle arrogance. The sensitive individual believes their inner world is too complex to be constrained, too refined to be disciplined, too wounded to be held accountable. This is not humility. It is avoidance disguised as depth. The trap tightens when sensitivity is used as moral leverage. Feeling more becomes a claim to knowing better. Reacting strongly becomes proof of truth. Discomfort is projected outward and blamed on others' insensitivity rather than one's own lack of containment. The world is experienced as crude, harsh, or unconscious, not because it is, but because the inner structure is insufficient to meet it. Authority would correct this. Authority would say, your emotions are information, not instruction. Authority would create order where sensitivity creates noise. Authority would transform feeling into force. Without authority, sensitivity collapses under pressure. It cannot withstand conflict. It cannot carry responsibility. It cannot lead, protect, or sustain anything beyond the inner landscape. Relationships become draining. Work becomes overwhelming. Life feels perpetually misaligned. This is not because sensitivity is weak. It is because sensitivity was never meant to rule alone. The psyche requires a governing principle. Something must decide. Something must choose. Something must hold tension without resolution. When sensitivity takes that role, the system destabilizes. When authority takes that role, Sensitivity becomes an asset rather than a liability. True authority does not silence feeling. It organizes it. It gives emotion a place, a time, and a function. It allows sensitivity to inform decisions without hijacking them. It turns inner experience into fuel instead of fog. The tragedy is that many sensitive people sense this intuitively but resist it emotionally. They fear that authority will flatten them, harden them, or erase what makes them unique. But what erases uniqueness is stagnation. What dulls sensitivity is overexposure without structure. Sensitivity becomes a trap when it replaces authority because it asks to be protected rather than trained, expressed rather than integrated, admired rather than challenged. And as long as sensitivity is treated as the highest value, the individual remains governed by reactions formed long before choice was possible, waiting for the world to accommodate an inner life that has never learned how to stand on its own under weight. The childhood narrative is often mistaken for truth, when in reality it is a shelter the psyche builds to survive what it cannot yet understand. It is a structure made of memory, emotion, and interpretation, assembled not to explain reality accurately, but to keep the inner world intact. As a shelter, it is necessary. As a home, it becomes suffocating. In childhood, the psyche lacks authority, context, and power. Experience arrives before meaning can be formed. Pain has no place to go, so it becomes story. The mind organizes chaos into a narrative that answers the only question a child can ask: why is this happening to me? The answer is rarely precise, but it is stabilizing. It creates coherence where there was threat. This narrative becomes a psychological roof. It keeps the psyche from fragmenting. It offers predictability. It explains the behavior of others in simple terms and assigns roles that make the world intelligible. Victim, protector, aggressor, savior. These roles are not chosen. They are inherited by necessity. The problem begins when the shelter is never dismantled. What protects the psyche early on does not evolve with it. The childhood narrative remains frozen in the emotional logic of the moment it was formed. It does not update itself with new evidence. It does not account for growth, strength, or agency. It continues to interpret present events through the lens of past vulnerability. As time passes, the narrative becomes more than explanation. It becomes identity. The individual does not merely remember what happened, they live inside it. Every challenge is filtered through the same assumptions. Every conflict confirms the old story. Every discomfort is interpreted as proof that the world is still dangerous, unfair, or overwhelming. The shelter becomes a prison with familiar walls. Living inside this structure feels safe because it is known. The psyche prefers familiar pain to unfamiliar responsibility. Stepping outside the narrative would require uncertainty, and uncertainty threatens the coherence the story provides. So the mind defends the shelter, even when it restricts growth. This is why many people speak endlessly about their childhood, but rarely move beyond it. The story is repeated, refined, and reinforced. It is analyzed, shared, and validated. Each retelling strengthens the walls. What began as protection turns into permanence. A shelter is meant to be temporary. It is designed to hold during storms, not to define the terrain of a lifetime. When the storm has passed, staying inside the shelter prevents adaptation. Muscles weaken, vision narrows. The world beyond becomes distorted through small openings. The psyche requires exposure to mature. It requires tension, risk, and responsibility. None of these can be fully encountered while living inside a childhood narrative. The story interprets all challenge as threat and all discomfort as danger. Growth is delayed not because it is impossible, but because it feels unsafe. The narrative also assigns power externally. Authority remains with parents, circumstances, or fate. The individual becomes skilled at explaining why things happen to them, but not at shaping what happens next. Causation replaces authorship. This dynamic is reinforced when insight is mistaken for evolution. Understanding the narrative feels like progress. Naming wounds feels like resolution. But awareness without movement is containment. not transformation. The shelter is examined but never exited. Eventually, the narrative begins to erode the present. Relationships are entered with expectations shaped by old walls. Work is approached with limitations inherited from childhood assumptions. Conflict triggers responses that belong to a younger self. The adult psyche is governed by a structure built for survival, not creation. Leaving the shelter feels like betrayal. The story carries emotional loyalty. It explains suffering and gives it meaning. Abandoning it can feel like denying one's own experience. But leaving does not require forgetting. It requires reassigning function. The childhood narrative must be demoted from identity to reference. It must become context, not command. This shift is not intellectual. It is behavioral. It occurs when the individual acts in ways the story says are impossible. A home is where one settles permanently. A shelter is where one waits until strength returns. Confusing the two leads to stagnation disguised as self-awareness. The psyche cannot build a future from the architecture of survival alone, and as long as the childhood narrative is treated as a place to live rather than a place to outgrow, the individual remains psychologically housed in a moment that has already passed, navigating adult life with the internal geometry of a child under threat. Empathy is often treated as evidence of moral advancement, but when it remains unintegrated, it quietly mutates into superiority. What begins as sensitivity to the inner states of others becomes a subtle claim to higher awareness, and from there, a concealed form of judgment. The individual feels deeply, notices more, reacts strongly, and mistakes these reactions for proof of ethical elevation. Unintegrated empathy lacks structure. It has perception without containment, resonance without authority. The empath feels everything but governs nothing. Without an inner hierarchy to organize experience, empathy spills outward unchecked. Emotional responses are not processed, they are projected. The inner world remains raw, and the external world becomes responsible for managing it. This is where moral distortion begins. The empath starts to believe that feeling more means understanding more, and understanding more means being right. Discomfort is interpreted as evidence of others' insensitivity rather than a signal of inner imbalance. Emotional reactions are elevated to moral verdicts. If something feels wrong, it must be wrong. If someone triggers pain, they must be unconscious. Empathy becomes a weapon disguised as care. Because it is unintegrated, empathy is not anchored in responsibility. The individual does not ask what their reactions reveal about themselves. Instead, they scan others for flaws. They notice microaggressions, tone shifts, energy changes, and interpret them through an unexamined inner lens. The focus remains outward, while the inner structure remains underdeveloped. Moral superiority emerges not through arrogance, but through fragility. The empath cannot tolerate being wrong because their identity is fused with their sensitivity. To challenge their interpretation feels like an attack on their self-worth. So disagreement is rebranded as harm. Boundaries are labeled as cruelty. Accountability is reframed as invalidation. This creates a psychological shield. By positioning themselves as more aware, more compassionate, more evolved, the empath avoids confronting their own unresolved material. They become the judge of emotional reality rather than a participant in it. The tragedy is that this superiority feels virtuous. It wears the language of care. It speaks in terms of safety, respect, and understanding. But beneath it lies avoidance. True empathy requires humility, and humility requires the capacity to see one's own distortions. Unintegrated empathy lacks this capacity because it has never been metabolized through self-confrontation. Integration demands that empathy be turned inward before it is directed outward. It requires the individual to feel their reactions fully without assigning blame. It requires them to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing whether their feelings are justified. This is an unbearable task for an identity built on being right through feeling. As a result, unintegrated empathy clings to certainty. It divides the world into those who feel correctly and those who do not, those who understand and those who are asleep, those who are safe and those who are dangerous, Complexity is flattened into moral hierarchy. Relationships suffer under this dynamic. Others feel monitored, corrected, or subtly shamed. Emotional closeness becomes conditional on agreement. The empath's presence carries an unspoken demand: align with my perception or be exposed as insensitive. This erodes trust, even as it masquerades as depth. Moral superiority also isolates. The empath wonders why they feel misunderstood, why people withdraw, why connection feels shallow. They attribute this to others' lack of depth, never considering that their own unresolved reactions create an atmosphere of judgment. Sensitivity without integration repels what it seeks. Integration would dismantle this structure. It would require the empath to relinquish the comfort of moral elevation and accept the risk of ordinariness. It would demand that they see their empathy not as proof of goodness, but as raw material for development. When empathy is integrated, it no longer needs to be announced. It no longer seeks validation. It does not require others to perform emotional correctness. Integrated empathy listens without conclusion. It feels without accusation. It recognizes that perception is shaped by history, and that feeling deeply does not grant immunity from distortion. Without integration, empathy continues to inflate the ego under the guise of virtue. It becomes a quiet hierarchy, where the empath stands above, observing, evaluating, and correcting, never realizing that what feels like moral clarity is often unresolved pain, looking for justification, and that until empathy is anchored in self-responsibility, it will continue to elevate the self at the expense of genuine connection and inner truth. An identity formed around wounds is adaptive at first. It gives shape to suffering and coherence to experience. It explains behavior, organizes memory, and offers a narrative through which pain can be understood. In moments of overwhelm, this identity provides meaning, and meaning stabilizes the psyche. But what stabilizes in crisis cannot sustain in growth. Wound-based identity is built in response to threat. It answers the question of survival, not creation. It teaches the psyche how to endure, how to anticipate danger, how to remain vigilant. These skills are essential early on, but they are limited in scope. They prepare the individual to protect themselves, not to expand. As time passes, the identity calcifies. The wound becomes central, no longer one aspect of experience, but the defining feature of the self. Choices, relationships, and aspirations are filtered through this lens. The individual does not ask who they are becoming, but what their wound allows or forbids. The past becomes the authority over the future. This creates a hidden dependency. The wound-based identity relies on the continuation of pain to remain coherent. Healing threatens the self-structure because it removes the organizing principle. Without the wound, the identity loses its reference point. Growth feels like erasure. This is why many people unconsciously sabotage progress. Success creates dissonance. Stability feels unfamiliar. Peace triggers anxiety. The psyche returns to conflict because conflict confirms the story. The future is resisted not because it is dangerous, but because it is undefined. An identity formed around wounds is reactive by nature. It orients itself around avoidance and defense. It scans for threat, anticipates rejection, and prepares for loss. This consumes enormous psychic energy. The individual becomes exhausted not by life itself, but by the constant effort to maintain a posture of protection. The future demands a different posture. Creation requires surplus energy. It requires curiosity, risk, and authorship. None of these are accessible while the psyche is organized around injury. The wound-based identity interprets challenge as danger and novelty as instability. It cannot tolerate uncertainty because uncertainty resembles the original chaos. As a result, the future feels hostile. New demands are experienced as unfair. Change feels like pressure rather than possibility. The individual remains oriented toward what must not happen instead of what could be built. This identity also externalizes authority. The cause of limitation is always outside the self. Parents Systems, relationships, or circumstances remain the source of explanation. Responsibility is postponed in the name of understanding. The individual becomes skilled at tracing causality, but not at exercising agency. The future, however, does not negotiate with explanations. It responds only to action. An identity formed around wounds cannot adapt because it is anchored in preservation. The future requires transformation. What resists transformation decays. Psychological structures that once provided stability become liabilities under new conditions. The strategies that once prevented collapse now prevent movement. There's also a moral cost. Wound-based identity often claims legitimacy through suffering. Pain becomes proof of depth. Endurance becomes evidence of virtue. This creates a subtle hierarchy in which growth feels like betrayal and strength feels undeserved. The individual remains loyal to pain because it has earned them recognition, but the future does not reward loyalty to the past. To survive the future, identity must be reorganized around capacity rather than injury. The wound must be integrated into a larger structure where it informs but does not govern. This requires relinquishing the emotional certainty of victimhood and accepting the ambiguity of authorship. Integration does not deny pain. It removes pain from the center of the self. It acknowledges the wound without allowing it to define what is possible. This shift is destabilizing because it removes the familiar compass. But without it, the psyche remains oriented backward. The future cannot be entered with an identity designed to survive what has already happened. It demands a self that can tolerate not knowing, withstand discomfort without retreating into story, and act without guarantees. An identity formed around wounds cannot meet these demands because it was never meant to, and as time accelerates and conditions change, what once kept the individual intact will increasingly isolate them from possibility, leaving them psychologically anchored to a moment that no longer exists, while the world moves forward without waiting. Rising is often imagined as expansion, visibility, or transcendence, but psychologically it begins with contraction. It begins with the withdrawal of projections. Projection is the psyche's way of avoiding its own weight by placing it elsewhere. What cannot be tolerated internally is assigned to people, systems, relationships, or fate. Rising requires reversing this movement and taking back what was scattered. Projection feels natural because it is efficient. It simplifies the inner world by exporting complexity. Anger becomes someone else's cruelty. Fear becomes external threat. Shame becomes societal injustice. This is not dishonesty. It is self-protection. The psyche offloads what it cannot yet hold. But projection carries a cost. Every emotion placed outside the self returns distorted. The individual becomes reactive, dependent on circumstances they cannot control. Inner life is governed by external events. Authority is surrendered to whatever carries the projection. Withdrawing projections is the moment authority returns. This process is not gentle. It is destabilizing because it removes the psychological buffer between the self and its contents. When projections are withdrawn, the individual is confronted with the full weight of their inner world without narrative escape. Emotions no longer belong to others. Patterns can no longer be blamed on history alone. Responsibility intensifies. Accepting inner burden does not mean self-blame. It means self-containment. It is the decision to carry one's psychological material without demanding immediate relief or validation. The individual learns to sit with discomfort without turning it into accusation or story. This is where most retreat. Projection offers moral clarity. Someone is wrong, something is broken, the world is at fault. Withdrawing projection dissolves this clarity and replaces it with ambiguity. The individual must tolerate not knowing whether their pain is justified. They must accept that multiple truths can coexist. This demands strength, not insight. Inner burden is heavy because it cannot be shared in the way projection can. It cannot be discharged through complaint, alignment, or outrage. It must be borne internally long enough to be transformed. This is the work most people avoid while speaking endlessly about growth. Rising is not becoming lighter. It is becoming more capable of holding weight. As projections are withdrawn, the psyche reorganizes. Emotional reactions slow, patterns become visible, repetition loses its urgency. The individual notices how often they demanded the world resolve what belonged to their own development. This recognition is humbling. Accepting inner burden also dismantles the fantasy of rescue. No person, system, or ideology can carry what the psyche refuses to integrate. This realization ends dependency. The individual stops waiting for circumstances to change and begins to change how they meet circumstances. Authority emerges here not as control over others, but as containment of self. The individual becomes less reactive, not because they feel less, but because they are no longer governed by displacement. Emotion informs action instead of dictating it. Withdrawing projections also transforms relationships. Others are no longer required to carry unprocessed material. Conflict becomes clearer. Expectations become more realistic. The emotional charge decreases, even as honesty increases. Connection shifts from mutual reassurance to mutual presence. There is grief in this process. Projections often carry hope. They contain the belief that something outside will finally make things right. Letting go of that belief feels like loss. The psyche must mourn the fantasy that pain can be resolved without inner work. But this grief is productive. It frees energy previously bound in blame. That energy becomes available for creation, discipline, and sustained effort. The individual becomes less dramatic and more effective. Inner burden is not permanent weight. It is weight that builds strength. Over time, what was once overwhelming becomes integrated. The psyche expands its capacity. The individual becomes more stable, not because life is easier, but because they are no longer outsourcing their stability. Rising means standing where projection once stood. It means allowing discomfort to exist without narrative escalation. It means recognizing that growth is not an escape from pain, but a deeper ability to contain it. Those who rise do not radiate constant calm or positivity. They radiate solidity. Their presence is grounded because their inner world is not scattered across others. They do not need agreement to feel secure. They do not need validation to remain intact. Withdrawing projections and accepting inner burden is not a dramatic transformation. It is quiet and internal, but it is irreversible. Once the psyche experiences the stability that comes from self-containment, it cannot return to the fragility of externalized blame, and what once felt like unbearable weight becomes the very foundation upon which a more ordered, responsible, and enduring self is formed.